Hello and welcome to another episode of CollectaThoughts, the show where I talk about video games, and today we're going to be talking about Voice of Cards, the Isle of Dragonroar. This is a Square Enix RPG that uses the gimmick of cards to kind of give a new presentation and style to this kind of JRPG genre. The way it works is everything in Voice of Cards is cards. Characters are cards, the environment is cards, and not in a way of, like a tower of cards, but more of, like a board game where each card has a drawing and that kind of symbolizes what it is. Like, for example, you'll have a path which is made out of brick, and then you'll have, for example, tall trees which stop your way, or a mountain which also stops your way, and then you'll have characters which you can walk into to have a conversation, or buildings which you can walk into to enter, of course. So it really is more like a regular JRPG translated into a different aesthetic or style, I guess you could say, and not so much a complete change to the genre like we've seen with some, for example, roguelike card games. And that's definitely my first thing to notice with this game, is that aside from the aesthetic, it really is kind of a regular RPG. Even when it does use things that fit this style, like having to play a dice before you use a certain ability and the dice result deciding the stats of that attack, which does make it feel more like a board game, but it's also something that to me I see as, well, this could also just be an RPG thing, but usually you wouldn't see it, it would just happen behind the scenes, so to say. Like in any game where you have a hit percentage. And I think the reason why the effect feels so diminished is because other times it just doesn't use some of these more board game ideas. Sometimes it just plays like a regular RPG. And I think it is in that, I don't want to call it laziness, but more lack of commitment to the idea of making this play and feel like a board game, that does kind of take away from it and does make you, be able to see behind the charade a lot more easily. So, since the idea of this game trying to cover up as a board game does fall apart quite easily, how does instead it fare as a JRPG? And well, it's okay. You basically have 3 party members you can run at one time, and you have a total of 6 party members you can change in between by the end of the game. And in terms of it being a JRPG, it is a very short one at about 13 to 15 hours, which feels weird saying that 15 hours is short, but if you've played any JRPG, you know that they tend to sit in the 30 plus hours camp. But honestly, that's not even a negative. I honestly was in the mood for a bit of a shorter RPG, and I think this kind of filled that up. It feels satisfying in the way that you do have that kind of same ideas of a big JRPG, but it's all very condensed and happening a lot faster. Like, for example, by the end of this game, I was very much at the max level with a level 30. Which means that in this game you'll level up about 3 levels per hour, which for a JRPG is quite high, I think. Giving you a more, shorter or faster kind of dopamine hit, and making it slightly more satisfactory without kind of losing steam by also being a lot shorter. So it does end up being this JRPG for people who maybe want that JRPG hit, but they just don't have the time right now. And I think that's pretty good. That's a good idea that it's not very filled in, as I do find that a lot of RPGs that are in this type of length tend to be a lot more different gameplay wise to regular RPGs, because usually their type of gameplay doesn't fit such a long gameplay style. And maybe the idea here was the same, but because it's Square Enix, or because the developers just didn't have enough time to make this into more of a board game than it is an RPG, it does end up just playing a lot like a regular RPG. And now let's talk about that. I already talked about your party members, but let's talk about how the game actually plays out. The game, while 3D, very much works in a 2D perspective where you look down at a board and you move in for different directions because of the way the cars are laid out and the way you move. Being able to, of course, always move with the car that's next to the car you're sitting on, but you can't really move diagonally except in the open world where cars are already kind of set diagonally. I guess the idea here was to make, the paths outside of town are a lot more dodgy and not so straight, right? But honestly, on the Switch, this is just a bit of an annoyance because it's kind of weird to hit the diagonal positions with the Joy-Cons, I think at least. Especially if you've been suffering with Joy-Con drift like I have. But to be fair, I think that would affect any game, especially games that have kind of a 2D perspective. That being said, I still didn't like it very much because it meant that while I was outside of town, I couldn't just move with the D-pad. I mean, I could, but it is just not as easy or precise, meaning that, of course, you also raise the chances of random encounters. Yes, this game still works by random encounters, which I guess has been something that is now more prevalent in smaller games as bigger and bigger budget games are able to actually put enemies on screen. So, I'm not like mad that this game doesn't have enemies on screen. I think it's fine. I think it makes sense in card wise. Honestly, something that I thought was stupid that they didn't do though was why not when you step on a card with an enemy, the card turns around and shows the enemy. I don't know why they don't do that. It's kind of a random encounter like in Pokemon, for example. It just kind of goes into the battle. But they could have done that. It would have been so simple. Anyways, nonetheless, as you move around and you do random encounters, which by the way, the random encounter percentage, let's call it, the percentage of it happening is very high. I feel like you can't go more than 4 or 5 steps without finding a different enemy, which can feel a bit annoying when you're trying to go somewhere really quick. But to be fair, I also understand because you can tell that the maps are not that big and they don't want you to just kind of cross a map without seeing any enemies. Also, something helping this is the fast travel sort of thing. Kind of, playing on the idea that this is a board game and you could just pick up a piece and put it back somewhere you already been. That's kind of the idea here. Basically, if you've been to a place already, you can just click the jump button and then using the right analog you can move it to a certain piece and then the piece will directly jump there. I'll be honest, a bit ashamed to admit this, I only found this feature very late in the game. Probably why I've reached the final dungeon of this game already max level. But I'm telling you now so you know and you don't have to do the same thing. But also going into the final level over leveled is a good idea because I do feel like the game does take quite a big difficulty spike around that time, which is okay for a game this short since, once again, not very hard to just grind out to max level, so it's fine, I guess. Now, speaking a bit more about the actual mechanics of it though, while you're in combat, you follow an order. This order seems to be dictated by the speed of the character. So some characters will just be naturally faster than others, but you can also change their stats with equipable items. That being said, the thing with equipable items here is that there isn't a whole lot of them, and so usually when you get something new, it is just legitimately better than whatever you had before. So usually the only real items you can change throughout the whole game and they keep their value, so to say, is rings. These usually just change, your stats very mildly, but every ring does that. And also sometimes they also have an extra power to them, like being able to make you resist certain types of damage, like electrical damage, darkness damage, which also leads me to talk about, the types of damage in this game, which are very simple, It's the usual Pokemon style type of advantages where water is weak against electricity and fire is strong against ice type of deal. Light against darkness, darkness against light, you get the idea. Something helping this is what I call the Shin Megami Tensei effect. And by that I mean with things like raising attack and lowering defense actually doing a fair bit, which does add a certain level of depth that wouldn't be there otherwise. Also, it's clear that each character definitely has some strong suits to them, like for example there's a witch, which you can probably guess what she does best, or this pet-like animal, I don't really know how to describe him, but of course, he's also kind of the brute force of the team. But regardless, the loop of the gameplay is surprisingly enjoyable as you kind of figure out what is the best team for you and kind of what is the best strategy to kind of get rid of most enemies or specific groups of enemies. Now, with that said, I think that also raises a problem of I don't feel like this game changes a whole lot as you level up. One of the things you gain as you level up is new attacks, which are stronger but also more expensive. Let me explain that. So the way attacks work, instead of using mana here, we have another tabletop kind of idea here with the gems. During the turn of each character you get a gem, and of course using spells or certain attacks use certain amounts of gems, and of course there also needs to be certain attacks that don't use gems at all, so you can save up on them, or you could also simply pass a turn, which is an option, especially if, for example, you filled your character with nothing but spells that use gems. Concept is cool, especially since you can, of course, abuse it quite a bit. There's a spell to create gems, there's also items that add gems for, maybe a more tight situation. But the way you have to work around these gems is definitely the most creative and unique piece of this game, and definitely what makes it stand out amongst other RPGs. And it's fun, it creates a rhythm to the game as you plan out each move you do, because since doing something with one character will affect what you can do with another one, since they all share the gems. Which I think also adds a little bit to the tabletop board game idea. These also lead me to talk about the other problem is, as you level up you get new powers, but they're also usually more expensive. Which it's cool to have some kind of leeway of just having a really powerful attack on your side, but having to work around the cost of them is a bit annoying. My thing here is really that I just wish they would give you more weaker attacks or maybe weaker options, more things like the spell that adds 2 gems, so you can have some more in-depth strategies on how to use these later stronger attacks, because as it stands it's kind of more of a just save it until you can use it kind of thing. And in that way it's definitely not how you should use these powers, because let's put it this way, an attack that costs 4 times more than another does not do 4 times the damage. So if you're gonna have to wait the turns anyway, because the advantage of doing this stronger attack is not taking the damage of those turns you'd have to be doing, then there really isn't much of a point, is there? Obviously the game does circumvent around this by having a lot of these stronger attacks also doing damage to all enemies, which is fairly useful of course, but I don't know. I wanted more variety and I do think it could have been there, even though this is somewhat of a short game. Regardless, it is still fairly enjoyable. Now moving on to the graphics of the game. I already talked about, it being cars and they're laid out in this kind of board game sense, and that's cool, it's a cool idea. But it does come with some caveats. For example, car that depicts the ocean always depicts the ocean the same way. So the ocean is just a bunch of cars that look exactly the same. Another thing is, for example, trees. So trees all look exactly the same because they're all the same car. I get the idea of keeping this level of consistency so you know what you can step and what you can't step on, or if you see something that's slightly out of your reach for some reason, you know that there's something you can reach there, or instead it's just more woods, right? But I do think aesthetically it is very jarring at times. It can feel like you're just kind of looking at a very bland scenery, which, kind of takes away from the idea that this is a very unique aesthetic unto itself. Especially in dungeons where suddenly everything just becomes very monotone in terms of color. And that being extra jarring because, you spend so much time in these dungeons and they have multiple levels that all look the same, and that's a bit disappointing, I think. That being said, one of the reasons why that's so disappointing is because actually the rest of the art in this game is pretty incredible. Honestly, everything in this game, character design wise, looks awesome. I mean, it's a very recognizable style. It's definitely something I feel like I've seen in other Square Enix games, but it looks great. I really like the character design, especially of the main characters and some other important side characters. I think, a lot of time was put into them and it shows and it's really cool. That being said, I have to also put a big asterisk here, as in, I was playing this game and I felt, well, this story kind of feels like it could be experienced by any age. It's a JRPG that's very family friendly for the most part. And I was like, wow, maybe that's the intention here, to make something that is somewhat simple, nice art, but simple game for, maybe a younger audience. And that's what I was thinking for a while, except suddenly the character designs get exceptionally sexual towards a certain part of the game. I'm just saying, a lot of skin and bulges are present, and I'm not a prude, I don't mind this, I just thought it was funny, given that I was till that point thinking, wow, I can recommend this to kids. So, be aware of that. Still though, the art is still great, even in those characters who one of them might or may not join your party. Regardless, when you're looking at characters, it looks good. When you're looking at the world as a whole, it can feel a bit bland due to the artistic direction they're going for. Now the final thing to talk about is the story, and honestly I was kind of avoiding talking about this because it's kind of a whatever RPG story. It's very simple. It's the reason why for so much of the game I thought, oh, this would be a good game for kids, because it's very surface level and a lot of the ideas are very simple, but not in a bad way. I will say though, with that said, that there's some plot twists that are honestly satisfying. I was gonna say that, early on in the game, there's these couple of characters that you're like, oh, I wonder what's gonna happen with these characters later on. But I was legitimately surprised when what happened wasn't the very obvious thing that I thought would happen with them, which is all I'm gonna say. They're very obvious. There's this group, and when you see them, you're gonna think, oh, this is gonna happen with these characters. And then it doesn't, and I'm like surprised. It was a nice twist. Regardless, I think this game was a nice twist. I, went in expecting something completely different, but, I was greeted with more of a traditional RPG, but that's not a bad thing. It was still quite an enjoyable experience. And for those reasons, I am giving Voice of Cards, The Isle of Dragon Roars, a 7 out of 10. I was gonna give it a 6, but I do think it just goes over that edge for me enough that I do think it deserves a 7. That being said, recommendations wise, I would definitely, wait for a sale on this one. It is kind of a simple and short game, and in the terms of the people I would recommend it to, well, not so much someone who's looking for something very different in JRPGs, but someone who's just kind of looking for maybe a short and sweet experience in that genre. Regardless of what you choose to do though, I hope that this video helped you in that decision. But even regardless of that, I hope that you enjoyed watching, and if so, please consider subscribing, liking and commenting, all the things you can do for free here on YouTube, now also disliking. And regardless of that, why didn't they call this Voice of the Cards? Why Voice of Cards just does not roll off the tongue. I'm sure a lot of people, mistitled this game because of that. I'm not sure why they did it. Goodbye.